Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another incredible episode of Authors on Mission podcast. My name is Danielle Hutchinson. I'm your host and Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission. Today, we are joined by Beverly Engel, who is an incredible licensed marriage and family therapist who has transformed her 35 years of clinical experience into 23 groundbreaking self-help books. Beverly has mastered the art of publishing, working with numerous publishers and agents over 25 years, and her work has reached international audiences through major media platforms like Oprah and CNN, and she is here today to share her extensive publishing journey and discuss how she's built a successful career writing self-help books that change lives. So without further ado, Beverly, it's an honor to have you on our show. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be with you.
Yes, so are we. Today's listeners, they're all about learning how to write a book. They're inspired by a certain topic. They want to get it out there. And I think that you're going to have some incredible insights on how to make that happen. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about trying to help people. I love helping writers.
Great. Well, before we get started, I always like to just ask if you can give everybody a little bit of an overview of who you are, how you got into this business, what inspired you to write your first book.
Well, I studied actually English in school. I was really good at writing compositions. It was one of my talents. So that's kind of where I started. But I was a therapist I had one of the few therapists at the time who were working with people who were sexually abused. And a lot of clients were coming in reporting that they had been sexually abused. I actually opened up a center, and I just started at first, was going to write like a pamphlet to give my clients when they came into the office, because I found that every client that came in, I was having to kind of tell them kind of the same introductory information, just, when we got started. So I just wanted to write a pamphlet to just kind of save some time, just have them read that instead of me kind of going through some things. And the pamphlet kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden it was a book. And it wasn't that I hadn't thought of writing a book before. I always was wanting to write a book, but this just kind of evolved. And I was very fortunate with that first book. First of all, there were no other books on the topic of how to recover from childhood sexual abuse. It was the very first book. I'll tell you about the other book in a minute. I lived in LA. I had some contacts. I just was really lucky. I had a friend who'd published a book. She turned me on to her editor. They bought the book right out of the gate. It was Tarcher, a very well-known publisher in LA. So I was very, very lucky with that. What I was unlucky about was that as the book was getting published, we found out there was a second book coming out about how to heal from childhood sexual abuse. And it happened to be called The Courage to Heal. Okay, which was huge. The Courage to Heal is like the Bible of childhood sexual abuse. It's like you can't compete with it. These two authors had worked for years and years and years. It was way thick. It was like the Bible of childhood sexual abuse. And my book came out it came out in hardcover and then paperback. When it was in paperback, here's this little paperback book compared to their thick book. And my book was just wiped out, with the competition. It wasn't like it wasn't selling, but it was supposed to be the first book, and it wasn't. This other book just kind of wiped me out. But Tarcher was a very big publisher. And the good news was that back in those days, authors didn't have to do their own publicity. There were publicists in the publishing company, in the business, and there are two now, but it was very different. They took charge. They booked me on Phil Donahue. They got a Washington Post article done for me, a Cleveland Plain Dealer. I had a tour through the US where I had multiple newspapers, radio, television, and that just doesn't happen anymore, okay? So the good news is that book was still a bestseller, and I was still considered like among my peers. The two women who wrote the book, The Courage to Heal, were not therapists. So I was still considered the first therapist who was talking about it. So I was the keynote speaker for all these, conferences, psychology conferences. So it was still a success. And I was very lucky to have all that happen, aside from the fact that I had this huge competition. Okay. My writing career was started by that. I was well known by that first book. And I went on to write, 25 more. I was very lucky in the beginning.
Yeah, it goes a long way to know that you've gone from one whole difficult challenge, having somebody else publishing a very similar book to yours around the same time, but you didn't, let that get in the way. You kept trying and you made even more books, and here you are now. And, after all these years, you've been able to see the publishing landscape change, which is a ballpark too.
Yeah, it's much, much different now. I'm jumping ahead, but if you're trying to sell a self-help book, number one, you have to write a great proposal. And in that proposal, you have to prove to the publishers that you're going to be able to market that book. You have to have a full marketing plan that includes podcasts and you going out, to conferences, to you doing, speaking engagements. I mean, you have to really prove it nowadays. So it's much harder for new writers at this point.
Yeah, well, it can be argued that these days it's difficult and also easy, because in a way, anybody these days can get onto Amazon and put their book up there. But then you're right. I mean, you have to take care of the marketing yourself. And, I think that's the benefit of sometimes working with the traditional publishers. And also there's many companies up there, like Authors on Mission, for example. We, offer marketing services along with your self-published book. So there's many avenues to take, but I definitely know what you're saying, where you have to make your book stand out. Would you say that moving forward from that first book, you approached it differently to ensure that it would be more of a unique sell to the market?
No, I had many years of not having to publish my own books. I mean, not having to publicize. That was just the first one. This trend of having the publishing company do, book you for programs, and now I had to start. I'd been on Phil Donahue. Then that led later on to Ricky Lake and Pete. These are people they probably don't know nowadays. Then I eventually got on Oprah, and I didn't do any of that publicity myself. That was all done by the publishing companies. The change came, much later. So I had it easy certainly for the first one, but for the first maybe 10 years, I had it easy because now I had a record of being on all these shows. And then it was easy to book me on the shows again, but I didn't have to do the booking or anything. And now the other thing that happened with the publishing industry, that affected the publishing industry, was that those talk shows that were selling my books no longer existed after a while. If you notice, there are no talk shows anymore. At the time, there was Phil Donahue, Oprah, Sally Jesse Raphael, Ricky Lake. I mean, they just went on and on and on. So you had lots of opportunities to go on television. Now, it's hard, unless you're already famous, you cannot get on a television show. And there aren't talk shows like the way they used to be. There's the AM programs where a famous author can go on, but that's it. So that's changed too. But I was lucky for the first 10 years. I had all that publicity already done for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about too, is your experiences on these talk shows. I mean, you've been on Oprah, and what was the other one I saw? CNN as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
Unfortunately, that you're right. It is a little bit more difficult for authors these days to, get on there, but perhaps there's some bits of wisdom you can share with us, because, nowadays authors can get on podcasts, for example. So I'm wondering, for the listeners out there who are wanting to market their books, what kind of tips would you give them, in regards to your experiences being interviewed on such, high, profile platforms, and maybe how they can adapt it into their own situations?
Yeah, I don't know if I can help with how to present yourself on the TV. If you're lucky enough to get on a show, you're probably already making it. It's just now podcasts have replaced that. have replaced those shows. So I would just encourage them to try to get on podcasts, and maybe they have to approach the podcast themselves, I suppose, or unless they have a publicist they hire. But now it's a podcast, and you just have to go on and present your ideas and present yourself as well as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. The more you get out there these days, it's only going to continue to benefit you and your brand. I agree completely.
Yeah.
And you especially know a lot about this. I mean, you have your Psychology Today blog, it's been published internationally. I guess I'm curious to know, out of all these different things, how has it evolved over the years? What's been most effective for you? I mean, you've built an international presence. What's been the most effective in building that?
Well, again, I can't take credit for the first 10 years or so, and then it was just my history. I did have the fortune to meet the ex-publisher of Psychology Today, and he was impressed with me. And I started writing a blog, which I've written now for, I think, 15 years. So I just make sure I keep writing my blog every month and have a new article. But that's kind of hard to do. You have to already have a name to be given that opportunity to write the blogs. Young people today have it all over me. They know more than I do about podcasts and blogs and, all this, Facebook and, all of it. I don't know any of that. I don't do any of that myself. And I hired a publicist once for $20,000 and got very little. So I'm not going to do that again. But I can't really help writers in that regard. I can help with some other tips. Okay. It's really, really super important that if you either learn how to write a good proposal or you hire someone to write you a good proposal. That's the only way you're going to sell a book. If you choose to go the self-publishing way, that's a whole other story. But to sell a book, you've got to hand either those publishers who take unsolicited, you got to have one that's really great, or you have to have an editor who submits it. But you got to learn how to write a good proposal. And there's a lot of information on that on the internet. You can do some learning on the internet, but you have to be concise. You have to be super clear about what your topic is. You need to prove to the publisher that your topic is something completely new. It may not actually be new, but you got to do a new twist to it, or do a new way of looking at it, a new way of working with it, or whatever. But you've got to prove to them, number one, that you're a good writer. Number two, that you can be organized. And there's a whole program for how to write a proposal. You got to be organized, and you have to have a new and creative and exciting idea. And then the major thing is you're going to show them how you're going to market it, how you're going to sell it. So it's a lot. You got to prove to those publishers a lot. If for self-help, for sure, you need to start with a very fresh idea, a fresh and new idea, or a fresh and new approach to the topic.
Yeah, and I mean, branching off of that, for example, I have this incredible book right here next to me. We have in the past, right? And so in a way, I have to say that, the way that you talked a lot about, repetition patterns after all of your years of experience, that's a unique approach to this type of topic. So I'm wondering, segueing into this, if you could just give us a little bit of an overview for all of our listeners out there, and kind of how did you decide to take repetition patterns as a topic and form it into this? So what was the process like?
It almost always starts, I almost always get the idea from the clients I'm seeing. And I'll start to see patterns. Like my very first book was because all these women and men were coming in reporting they had been sexually abused. And I thought, I wrote my pamphlet, and then I realized there was a book in it. But it's almost always the patterns that are coming in with the clients. And the last 10 years, I would say, it's become really, really clear that clients do repeat their trauma, in various negative ways. If they were emotionally abused as a child, they'll become attracted to emotionally abusive partners. If they were physically abused, they'll very often attract physically abusive. It may not be that direct sometimes. It may be harder to see and harder to find. Perhaps one of your parents was an alcoholic. You may find that you get involved with alcoholics all the time. That was my experience when I was young. My mother was an alcoholic. I come from an alcoholic family. And sure enough, I was very attracted to alcoholic men. I didn't know I was attracted to them. I didn't even know necessarily they were alcoholic, and I didn't know at first. But their personality, there was a darkness to them. There was a vulnerability to them that was very attractive. And the purpose of repeating those patterns, it's a very unconscious drive. What we're trying to do is we're trying to undo what happened to us. I was trying to undo my horrible history with this alcoholic family by doing it again with a different partner who had the same problem, and hopefully doing it right, somehow taking responsibility that if I could somehow get these alcoholic men to love me, that it would help me feel love. I would get to heal my relationships with my alcoholic family. It's really crazy when you think about it, that we would unconsciously go right back into the trauma and repeat the trauma with the idea that somehow it was going to turn out better this time, or we were going to do it better this time. Unfortunately, kids take on the responsibility of what their parents do and blame themselves. And so that's one aspect. It's like, if I can be different this time, maybe they'll love me. So I see it over and over and over. The choice of partners, the choice of friends, the choice of bosses, the choice of jobs. Your own behavior, repeating the patterns of your parents. It just happens so much. And I had been seeing it. I had been making a note of it. There were other books I wanted to write, and it just seemed like the right time. When Oprah started talking about trauma, when she wrote a book about trauma with a famous psychologist, that was like, trauma now is in the public eye. And so I knew it was probably a really good time to write it.
Well, it seems like a lot of factors went into this decision. I mean, one, you had a great idea for the current market for this sort of book. You knew that it was the right time because it was becoming more of a trending topic due to, Oprah and other, people writing about it. And it was also something you noticed that was a pattern in your clients, which goes to show that a lot of people are dealing with it, which by nature means it's something people need to hear about. It's like,
right.
What I'm noticing is you found a need and you filled that need, I guess, in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it, right?
Yeah, and as I was reading this, I noticed, of course, this is a very sensitive topic. It's hard for people to write about. A lot of our listeners right now probably have ideas for similar topics, but don't quite know how to approach it without being too straightforward or not sensitive enough. And I have to say, you did an amazing job of just balancing that voice, like, stern in a way that you're identifying it, but also caring and empathetic. I wonder, is that something you'd like to perhaps offer some tips about? How can somebody who wants to write about this effectively convey those messages in a way that helps, but also heals?
Yeah, you're right. That it was a really good way of putting it. It's a fine balance between being direct. I get really impatient with authors that don't get to the point. They go chapters and chapters and we don't know really what the point is yet. So I like to get to the point. I like a reader to open the book and first page, read what the book is about. Okay. Know what's going to happen and know whether or not that book relates to them. So I think it's really important to get to the point. But the other thing you need to really pay attention to if you're writing to trauma victims is that trauma victims are very particular in terms of their reaction. They can't hold too much negative energy. They can't hold too much negative information. So you can't bombard them with a whole bunch of facts and a whole bunch of stuff that they need to know. You have to kind of draw that out throughout the book. Be slow in your approach. Be fast when you make the point of what the book is about and what the book is going to offer. And then if there's information that you're sharing, research information or your own personal experience, you need to draw that out slowly. And you need to repeat it because trauma victims, they're often unable to hold the information. They will forget the information, especially if it's painful. So, I usually at the end of each chapter kind of do some repetition of what we talked about in that chapter. So it's a combination of being direct, but not being too pushy and not being too traumatizing.
I was going to flip to one of your reflection questions.
Oh, okay.
As an example to all of our listeners, you have exercises, and reflection questions to restate those facts, which just goes to prove your point a little bit more, right?
Right,
Like
right.
you're
Yeah,
saying, you need to repeat it and really let the reader understand it.
yeah,
So go ahead.
yeah. And that leads into what I was going to say is that there's kind of a formula where you need to connect with the reader emotionally, either by telling your own story or telling a client's story or telling a human story. And then you need to offer exercises or reflections. You may need to offer like a repetition of what you wrote on. You need to offer some research information because there's some readers who just absolutely need the research. They're not going to believe you. Doesn't matter if you have 35 years of experience as a therapist, they're not going to believe you until you offer some science. So you have to do some personal reflection, some client experiences, some exercises, some repetition, and some research.
It's a lot to go in there, but it's all
Yeah.
important. It all has a role to play, especially in your book. I mean, you have techniques for identifying the recurring patterns too, right? I mean, perhaps somebody doesn't even know that they're in this type of cycle. So that's another important element too. Like,
Yeah, that's questionnaires. That kind of combines with the exercises. It's questionnaires to find out if this book is for you. Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, I mean, this is an amazing resource. I think it's something that, if our listeners are at all inspired today to write their own book of this topic, that's, an incredible thing. But also, I mean, it's something to pick up on your own too, because you might not even realize that you might be in these behaviors yourself. So, I mean,
Right.
picking that up and doing the questionnaires, that's a whole nother aspect to it. Being able to improve yourself as well.
Right. And we all have friends or children or relatives that we can see that they're repeating a pattern, but they can't see it. We can see that your best girlfriend is always attracted to the same kind of guy. It always ends up the same way, but she doesn't see it. Your daughter always has the same conflicts with people over and over and over, but she doesn't see it. So the book is not written for people to help other people, but it's a good resource if you're questioning, especially your own children, if they're repeating a pattern.
And you know what I'm noticing, Beverly, is that, in a way, you targeted this not to just one specific audience, which is great. You broadened the scope in order to make it relatable to many different types of readers. I mean, you have the people who might be in these, cycles themselves, or there are people who see it in other people, or whatever the case is. I think that's incredible that you were able to market it in that way. I think that widens and broadens the approach.
Yeah, the wider the audience you have, the better. The audience for this book is understandably pretty small, but generally when you're going to do a self-help book, you need to try to find a very large audience. You really think about who might be able to benefit from it, even if it's hard to think about. Professionals read my books all the time, and professionals refer my books to their clients. That's an audience. So think about, who else besides the person that you're targeting could be an audience.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that, you target these audiences to make them broad, but you wrote many different books. This is just one of them, and each one is in its own way tailored to another subsection of a similar topic. So I think that's
Right.
very interesting too, because in that way you are reaching a wide audience and a narrow niche at the same time. For example, your book, It Wasn't Your Fault, is more of a approach to healing abuse through self-compassion. It's not about like the cycle as much as like healing.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Yeah.
And I've written some books specifically for women. I wrote a book called Loving Him Without Losing You. That was quite popular. And it addresses the female's tendency to lose herself in a relationship by taking on his interests, dropping her own interests, not standing up for herself, going along with things that really aren't healthy for her. So it's like a real specific guidebook about how to stop doing that, because women do that. We do lose ourselves in relationships. One of my latest books was called The Nice Girl Syndrome, which really reflects on, the fact again that not so much anymore, but it still happens that, women tend to be nice. We tend not to speak up for ourselves. We tend not to argue. We tend to just go along. And it's, a real prescriptive book on how to stop being so nice and where that niceness comes from. There's like 4 major causes for niceness. So, I've also just addressed females, and that's been really interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is the more that we're talking about this, I'm noticing you have sort of all different types of audiences because of the way you branch out, but then also narrow these niches. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for our listeners today in terms of how do you shape your books from being, such a wide audience to narrow audiences, but also, for example, when you're speaking on your professional interviews with like CNN and Oprah, you have to, target it one way, whereas, maybe if you're talking to somebody else, you target it a different way. What kind of tips would you have for somebody who has an idea? How do you branch out in these ways?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. On a TV show, the interviewer is kind of in charge of what you're going to talk about, and they have you on their show to address your particular book. And so the whole interview is focused on that book. And you just kind of go through the topic, the main topics of your book and what you think is the highlights of your book. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I guess sort of, or more so like, how do you take your topic and focus it in such different areas? Like, for example, you focus on trauma, right? But you're able to take that topic and branch it out in so many different ways. What advice might you give to somebody else who wants to write about a certain topic? How would they themselves be able to target towards these audiences? What steps might you take actively to do that?
Yeah, I don't just focus on trauma. I focused on trauma in the last, say, maybe 8 years.
Okay.
But before that, like Loving Him Without Losing You is not about trauma. There's a little bit about it, but not mostly. The Nice Girl Syndrome had a little bit about it. So because I'm a psychotherapist, I have the option of talking about lots and lots of topics, that affect clients, that cause clients to come in for therapy. So usually that's where I get my ideas, is what my clients are presenting. And I always include case examples in my book. I always change the identity of the people and the situations and circumstances. But, I'm very lucky because I've been a psychotherapist all these years. And so I have all that information that I can share, that I can choose. If somebody's got an interesting topic they want to talk about, I just would encourage them to do a lot of research to find out what else has been said before them. That's always the starting point with self-help, is have other people address this, and what did they say? That just because somebody else has addressed it doesn't mean that you don't write the book. Find out what their point of view is, what the research on that is, and then think about whether you could have a new point of view. If you know a new way to handle it, if you have some new ideas, then that's always great. But start with what's already out there, with the research that's already there. That'll give you a good grounding for your ideas to come off to.
Thank you for offering those tips. That's exactly where I was going with that, right? Because
Okay.
it's about finding that niche, that need in the market, and then branching off of that and targeting it to people who need to hear it, just like we said before too. So that's incredible things to hear. And being that you have so much experience as a therapist for all these years, I'm curious to know, have you found that writing these books directly impacts your practice or perhaps your reach to others? And have you heard a lot of feedback perhaps from your clients or other readers in terms of how you changed their lives, or your word resonated with them?
I try to keep that pretty separate. Sure, I do get referrals from people that have read my books. That's my main referral source at this point. I don't go out and try to get clients. I don't have to worry about that at this point. Clients will come to me because of my books. So yeah, there's a strong connection between my books and my clients for sure. One thing that people can do too, that you have that I didn't have when I first started writing, is Google and all the research that's on the internet and all the internet magazines. Put your idea into Google and see how many other people have written about that topic in magazines. There's some very popular magazines that write about, if you're writing about psychology, if you're writing about nutrition, if you're writing about health, if you're writing about a disease, you will find an enormous amount of articles already written. There's psychology articles in journals, and then there's popular magazines that are writing about that topic. You find out, number one, how much interest there is in that topic by how many articles you find. But then you go through and read the articles and see, again, do I have something new to offer, or has it already been said? And nowadays, a lot has already been said because of all these magazines, and all the podcasts out there. So you have to ask yourself, do I have something really new and revolutionary that I can share, or my own experience? Your own experience is always a good idea to write about. So you have that. I didn't have that when I first started writing. I couldn't go on Google and look up how many articles. I went to the UCLA library, and tried to look up how many magazine or periodicals or whatever had been written, or how many books had been written. But so it's really easy to do nowadays, to kind of figure out what topics are going to sell and what aren't.
So again, I think it's incredible that, you went through all of these trials, in the publishing journey, that these days, unfortunately, it's actually a lot easier to do. But because you went through this process, you know more about the work in the practice and the dedication it takes to making your book come alive, like going to the physical library, looking up those books, those resources, making sure that everything is set in stone. I think that's just incredible. And not to mention, these books have been published in many different languages all over the world. I guess that's kind of where I'd like to branch into. What was that like, and how did you end up translating it and spreading your reach that far? Did you have a big role to play yourself, or was that mainly your publishers that were able to
No, that was all the publishers. I've been published in Iran and Uzbekistan and Russia and Korea, and just really strange places, strange places in terms of me not thinking that these people are going to be interested in my topics. But it's amazing how many people all over the world are interested in the topics. And you had asked me before if I had to change my book, in order to have it be more readable for other countries. I don't really do that. Sometimes I'm asked to write a foreword in English that they translate. And in the foreword, I will sometimes address the fact that, like in an Arab country, I will address some of the difficulties. It's like, for example, it's very difficult for a victim of sexual abuse in an Arab country to ever come out and talk about it, to ever report it. So they feel more alone than we do in America, because we talk about it and people come out and talk about it. They never do. It's dangerous to talk about it. So I write about that in the foreword, about how difficult it is, how much I understand how difficult it is. And I really feel great when I write, a foreword for a book that's going to go to Iran on how to, loving him without losing you, or the nice girl syndrome, because I can talk to females in Iran who are being completely dominated and have no voice, but they're obviously wanting to change, and they're finding the book. So I write about that in the foreword. So I don't have to change my actual book, but I will work on a new foreword to kind of address their particular problems.
I'm actually a little bit surprised by that, because there's huge differences in how these cultures approach it. That the forward kind of does it for you in a way that introduces it and acknowledges that.
The only thing I will do in a book is sometimes I will have the name of the case example. I always include a Hispanic name, and often now I include a name that kind of is Middle Eastern, as a Middle Eastern, like Fatima. I'll always put somebody who's Middle Eastern, always put somebody who's Hispanic. I always put somebody that the name kind of sounds like a Black name. I started doing that many years ago, because otherwise I was just saying, Jane and Marcia and Cleo and Tiffany and, and when the book started selling to foreign countries, I figured, they're not going to really identify with Tiffany that much, but maybe they'll identify with Fatima,
That's a wonderful, very quick, easy tip. For anybody, whether or not your book's going to be published internationally or not, It's very important to this day and age to make sure you're including examples that relate to all different types of readers. It
Yeah.
shouldn't all be just Jane or Bob or whatever it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, you have to identify with everybody.
Yeah. And in my forward of my own books, in the English language books, I always address nowadays, well, it's going to be probably more difficult in the future, but I always address the fact that this book can apply to anyone, whether you're heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, binary, non-binary. In the last few years, I always write about that. This book is applicable to anyone, to any sex, to any circumstance. That's in the last few years been very important to do. And if even the book like Loving Him Without Losing You, I was on a speaking engagement once and I noticed there were several men in the audience. And one man said, "Why did you entitle it Loving Him Without Losing You?" Because I'm a man and I have the same problems. I do the same things. I lose myself in my relationships. So I had to start thinking, wow, I always, again, address, he or she, I alternate it. Nowadays, they just have you say they, you don't go through he dash she anymore. You just say they, even though it's grammatically incorrect, just to solve that problem, because there's so many men who get very offended when you write a book and you're saying she is the victim, for example, or she who has this problem, when they identify that problem with themselves and they feel ignored. So that was another lesson.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good, clear, clean-cut, actionable advice that anybody could take, right? The words we use could either be served to alienate or include somebody. And, the simple act of changing a he or a she to a they, I mean, that allows your audience to be broadened even more. So that's a cool tip. Do you have any other advice along those lines? Maybe some other way that we can make sure that we're reaching all types of readers?
No, just by the names I use and the examples. I just want to make sure I bring examples of every culture in there.
Definitely. And I think that's incredible to know. And I mean, honestly, everything that you've shared today so far are tips that any self-help author can benefit from. And, and even anybody who might be experiencing, these things themselves. I mean, we've already discussed, ways to identify these problems. And, if you're interested in learning more, everybody, I mean, these books are available on Amazon and anywhere else you can find it. And Beverly, you do offer some other resources yourself too, right? So would you mind sharing with everybody how they might be able to get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about what you do and your guidance?
Yeah, I have a website, www.beverlyengel.com. And that's also my email address, beverlyengel.com. I have another website called healmyshame.com. And that I write a lot about shame. And so it's a whole website with my articles and research and ideas about shame, which is very important. So yeah, they can get in touch with me those ways.
Perfect. And you know what, everybody, we're going to put those links right in the description box of this podcast. So you can go ahead and just click that right now as soon as we're done today and check out these resources, because like we've been talking about, these types of books and these strategies and tips, they apply to everybody, one way or another. It's something we can all learn from today. So yeah, in addition to these amazing writing tips and these publishing tips, we also have tips for our own well-being and strategies to help others too. So I really appreciate that, Beverly. Thank you for sharing all that with us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You have so many books out. You have been doing this for many years. I'm wondering, what's on the horizon for you? What's next for Beverly in terms of, any other books coming out or anything we could look out for in the future?
Well, I've only had 2 books turned down, rejected, 2 proposals completely rejected in my lifetime. And I had a book on regret that was rejected recently by my agent. He did send it out. So publishers rejected it. There were a couple of people who wanted to buy it, but the fee they were going to give me was so low, it wasn't going to be worth it. So I want to get back to that. I want to get back to regret. And I want to maybe talk about the regret specifically that parents have about the way they raise their children, whether they were abusive or neglectful I think I have a lot of clients who come in who are very regretful for the way they treated their children. And I'd like to offer them some help about how they can remedy that, how they can go back into the relationship, usually with their grown children, and try to mend those relationships, and how they can make changes in themselves so they don't keep treating people in the way they were treating them.
Yeah,
So I'm going to give it another try.
I think you definitely should. I mean, get out there, start writing it, and make those publishers regret not taking regret. Because, yeah, I mean, hey, we all experience that too. It's, again, another very important topic, just like this one right here, that should be reached out. So I guess, let's all look out for that in the future. And Beverly, we'd love to have you back on to continue promoting it, and so everybody can, find more information about it and know when it's going to
Okay. Yeah, I want to encourage writers, don't give up. Like I said, it's very hard to write a great proposal, and you have to write a great proposal nowadays. So if you get rejected, don't give up. You can change it a little bit, rework the proposal, get a new agent. You can try different tactics. Don't give up. If you think it's an important topic and you want to publish it, and there's always the self-publishing route nowadays, again, which, is a great opportunity. So don't give up. If it feels important to you, if it feels important for you to communicate information about this particular topic, don't give up. Keep trying. Maybe you'll have to change things, to get to the publishers or get to an agent, but keep working at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody today, take that advice to heart. Even after today's podcast, go out there, just start writing, start making moves. Don't let anything drag you down. Just like Beverly said, you can't just give up. You can't let these dreams go away, because at the end of the day, you never know what's going to come of it. I mean, here Beverly, she's written so many books after being, turned away at first, and here we are, we have to keep trying. So thanks for that last advice. That's powerful for us. So thank you so much for sharing it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Well, and honestly, thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. And to all of our listeners, that wraps up our conversation with Beverly Engel, who's shown us how to transform her decades of expertise into life-changing books. And, she's worked on so many different topics, as we heard, from shame and trauma, and her publishing journey spanning over 25 years. So thank you for sharing with us what it means to write self-help books, to have an international presence, and dedicate yourself to demonstrating how powerful the written word can really be in creating positive change. So to all of our listeners today, check out Beverly's books. We're going to put the links in the chat. And remember that, you too can be empowered and inspired to bring your knowledge into the world through the written word. So keep that in mind. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to authorsonamission.com and find out how we can take your book idea and bring it to life. And likewise, if you're finding Beverly's tips and strategies useful as much as I have today, she has an incredible wealth of resources as well. So without further ado, everybody, we'll see you next time. And until then, keep writing, keep growing, and keep making a difference. And Beverly, thanks again for joining us.
You're welcome. It's been great.
It's been great. All right, everybody, have an amazing day. Thanks for listening.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.